talk about introversion. I myself am a really strong introvert. And until Susan Cain's TED Talk and book came out, that really launched a revolution around particularly challenging the workplace, but also the schools to illuminate the strengths of introversion and shift things so that the world isn't quite so extrovert centric. And I wanted to do that in this course because many of the people that I work with are introverts too. And I want to talk, first of all, about some terminology. Introversion is a personality trait, and it's contrasted to extroversion. And you'll sometimes hear the word ambivert, which is that center place where people can be both and introverted and extroverted, depending on the situation, and really depending on their, how they're drawn, certain parts of themselves are drawn out. And so introversion, I have several comics here just because I think introversion is so, it just needs more attention and more understanding. And it's a trait, it's a hard wiring within us around how we tend to process information and stimuli. And introverts process internally. And we tend to thrive. We fill up our inner well, our inner energy well, by being alone. It can be draining to be with other people, particularly large groups. And so it's really literally like we recharge our batteries by having time alone. Now, I want to contrast this to anxiety because I think quite often shyness, perfectionism, and anxiety get collapsed with introversion. And I have experienced a significant amount of anxiety in my life. So I don't want to pathologize anxiety. It's really hardwired into our nervous system, and all of us have anxiety and worry at some point in our life. And sometimes there's specific circumstances that bring that out in us. For me, I have a lot of anxiety around travel. And for other people, it can be, speaking in front of a group or interviewing can be a very anxiety-ridden experience. But it is not the same as introversion. Certainly it coexists with introversion, but it is something different. And so we're going to talk about anxiety and also confidence in the section in this course when we go into mind management and perspective. And so that will come later. And so that's why it's important for me to make this distinction here. And so confidence is also collapsed, I think, mistakenly with introversion. Introverts can be very confident. We can also suffer from a lack of self-confidence. And so it's just a different beast. Confidence really has to do with what you think you're capable of and also what your data points are from your previous experiences. And you'll see this term I have here, the zone of proximal development, which this comes from another part of my life when I taught reading. And there's this formula around introducing, particularly for emergent readers, when they're first acquiring the ability to decipher written language, to how much new terminology do you introduce to a new reader so that they can grow as a reader and not get paralyzed and sacrifice comprehension. And that is called the zone of proximal development. And I've used that, I've translated that to some of my coaching work because it's it's this area where we're slightly stretched out of our comfort zone, but we're not into a place of paralysis. And so that's an important part to remember when you're talking about confidence and how you want to stretch yourself. Social skills are also distinct from introversion. You can be an introvert and have very strong social skills. And in fact, I think a lot of introverts, because we are usually quite attentive, have sort of a radar and get a sense of what other people are seeking from us. So we can have highly refined social skills. We can also really have terrible social skills and want to develop in this area. For myself, I emerged from high school with almost no social skills. And I had a roommate in college who really helped me. She literally taught me and cued me on how to engage with people when I would first meet them. And so it's really truly a skill that can be acquired. And so social skills are distinct from introversion. You can still want to work on it and have it as something that is an area that you want to have growth in and add to your repertoire. And you'll see in the list of resources that is attached to this module, there is a list of introvert resources, and one of them is specifically geared toward introvert or social skills. It's a book called Captivate, and also a YouTube channel. And so that is worth referencing, because we'll talk a little bit about it during the interviewing portion and networking portion, but it is, again, it's distinct from introversion. And then the last term that I want to pull apart from introversion is, it's called high sensitivity. Sometimes you'll hear it as HSP, highly sensitive person. And you'll see this website here that's listed. There's also, I think someone on Sounds True has recently released some content that covers, she calls it empath. So that's another term that can be associated with this. And this really has to do with the nervous system's predisposed response to external stimuli. And so if you're curious about this, it's helpful. I think there's an online quiz on this website that's listed here. And I think if you go to soundstrue.com, which is a wonderful audio, it's a sales page for many audio books and resources. I think Google Empath, which is short for empathic. I think there's a quiz there that's associated with that. I'll add that to the resource list so you have that. So here are all of the terms together so that you can see and look at the distinction between them, and know that we're going to touch on each of these areas except for high sensitivity. So if you're looking for those resources around that, use that resources document. As far as the Introverts Toolbox for a job search, two key things. The first is, we tend to thrive when we have had the opportunity to anticipate what may come up in our engagements with people, either through our networking or through the interview process. And so there's a huge emphasis on research, and we'll talk about this as we move through this process. And this LI is short for LinkedIn. So using email and LinkedIn and doing a lot of advanced prep work so that you feel armed and equipped when you go into either a networking situation or an interview situation, so that you your confidence can shine and also your brilliance can come through. And we'll talk about this too in interview preparation, the interview preparation module, but I think it's particularly helpful for introverts specifically to take notes into an interview. And I will specify in the interview module how, what types of things to take in with you, and also what to write down when you're in an interview. But it's really important because we process internally during an interview to make sure that you maintain connection with the interviewer. And so what that looks like is when you're deliberating and kind of the gears that are the wheels in your brain are moving, usually we go quiet or we panic and try to fill the space. And so it can be helpful to have a few phrases that allow you to slow yourself down and give yourself a little bit of think time, and also cue the interviewer about what you're doing. So you can say things like, "Oh, that is a really good question. I wasn't prepared for that question. So let me just think about that for a minute. Let me actually look at my notes here." So that kind of think aloud is important to rehearse and consider as a useful part of your repertoire when you are in an interview. Also, as introverts, we think of the best response like 10 minutes later. Because it's sort of like this background program that's running, and then it surfaces later, but the conversation has moved on. And so it's really important to remember that whether you're in a networking conversation or an interview, that you'll have the chance to remedy or insert your amazing content that came to you on a delayed reaction. You can do that through a thank you note, or, if you're in a screening interview, then you can talk in the next interview about that. So, what that looks like in a thank you note is, you put in the regular content. "Thanks so much for your time. I really appreciated the opportunity to speak to you about X position." And then say something like, "As I've been reflecting on our time together, one of the questions that has stayed with me is Y question." And then say, "I want to add a little bit to my response," and then put a little short note about what your genius insight that came to you. And then close the way you usually would in a thank you note, which I remain very interested in the position, and I hope to hear from you soon regarding the next steps. So you don't add a lot of substance to a thank you note when you're trying to do something like this. Brevity is still important, but it's just helpful for you also to know it's okay. I can inject this content on my terms at a different point in the process. And if you had a screening interview and then you have the next interview, you can do the same thing where you can say early in the process, or when there's a related question, you can say, "Oh, I remember we talked about this during the screening interview. And one of the things that I forgot to add that has come to me since is blah, blah, blah." So also it will be very helpful and important to rehearse and prepare responses for interview questions. And you'll see during the interview module that I will include a link to an article that I use. In fact, I had a client tell me recently, she said, "I am so glad you sent me that article. I think it has something like the 31 most frequently asked interview questions and the responses that you should give." And she said, half of those questions came up in my interview. So that type of preparation is going to be really important in this process. The other thing that's important, particularly for introverts, is during the interview, is to assess the physical environment. Is this Cubeville? Are you in an open office environment? Because if you don't have a door or a place to retreat to, then that's something that's important for you to consider. And, maybe there are some workarounds for that. And it's not a deal breaker, but it could be something that gives you a little bit of a pause as you consider and evaluate different offers. Also, I think it's helpful to mention your introversion, particularly if you get a question about what are your strengths, and talk about it as a positive and notice whether that is well received or not. Also, I think it can be helpful to when you get to the part in the interview where they say, and what questions do you have for us? You can talk. One of the things you can say is, I'm curious about how you generate ideas or invite input when there are projects. And because silent brainstorming is a new, well, maybe not so new, but it's a technique that is very inclusive to introverts. Rather than just sitting around a table and tossing ideas out, you'll sometimes see a question on a whiteboard and people are invited over time to write their responses. And that is a very introvert friendly way. So you can see if they mention that, or you can even talk about it as something that's been used in the past and you found very helpful. You can also drop names, like talk about Susan Cain and her TED Talk, because it's one of the top TED Talks of all time. So, and just see if people are familiar with it. So what's important too during a job search is to take into account, how are you recharging? And what is going to be important for you to set up in the infrastructure of your job search. And this is something that you can include on your goal sheet for the Excel spreadsheet that we talked about in the previous module. Is there something like you want to schedule a certain amount of time each week for you to have particular recharge time so that you make sure that you don't burn yourself out during this process? So the action steps that I want you to consider is, if you have not watched Susan Cain's TED Talk, or it's been a while since you've seen it, it's just so affirming and validating to see it. And so it is on the list of resources that you'll find on the Introvert Resource page. Review that list of resources and use the links. And these little images that you saw in this presentation, most of them came from Instagram, and I just love following people who are introverts on Instagram because it just makes me think I'm not alone, and there's comical and fun connections around that. And then the last thing I want you to do is write yourself a permission slip. What is going to be most helpful for you to remember as you're going through this process? Is it that you deserve to prioritize your replenishment time? Is it that you will prioritize your research and rehearsal and invest in yourself in that way? What is going to set your introverted self up for success during this process? Give that to yourself. It'll really make a difference in your success as you move forward.